So, as I said, we're going to talk about prophecy. I wanted to open with a question. What do you think non-believers think of when they hear we believe in prophecy?
Yeah.
Fortune telling? Okay. Anything
What
else?
do they think prophecy is, or what do they think about us?
Both.
I think they think it's weird.
They think what?
They probably think it's weird.
Or like a cop out,
They probably think it's weird. Okay.
easy, I would think, easy answer to
Okay.
hard questions.
Why do you think they would think it's weird?
It's kind of countercultural. You know, they sort of a bizarre concept. If you don't like prophecy for what? Telling the future.
Yeah.
You can't explain it with science either. It's something you can't explain. There's
I
no
mean-
logic to it.
Yeah, something you can't explain through science. Okay. I mean, I think especially like if you think of it as fortune telling, that's usually not looked upon in our culture in a good light, probably for good reason. But then you kind of said something like it's easy. What do you mean exactly?
Just like, it's a, since it's not, since it hasn't happened, like, you're like, well, I don't know how to word it. It's like an easy answer to hard questions now.
Okay,
I
that's
don't know.
interesting. Where I thought you were going with that is like sometimes people think because some Christians believe like in the rapture, they think of that as like an escape. Like you need to live in the here and now, not be looking forward to something, which I think you could have both, actually. It's kind of a false dilemma. Yeah, that's good. People in our small group have been talking about, like, they're kind of worried that people that come to our church for the first time, like in the last few weeks, might be weirded out because we're talking about Revelation. There's like a bunch of weird visions in that book. There was actually a guy who came for the first time 2 weeks ago that me and another guy have been kind of inviting, and he said it was great. So I don't know.
Did he come back?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I think they're
That's how
gonna-
you know.
I think they're gonna come for good now. But I think part of the problem is a lot of people, when they think of prophecy, they just think of the end times. And you know, Revelation's a pretty weird book. That was actually the least copied book of the New Testament. And some people think it's because like there's all those weird symbols in there, weird prophecies. But you know, really, prophecy's more than that. There were prophecies made in the Bible that came true, like at that time. There were prophecies that were made in the Bible that didn't come true till later, but they've already come true. And then there are still prophecies yet to come. I've heard that there's actually like a few hundred prophecies about the Messiah, and only half of them have been fulfilled. So you've actually got kind of a twist to, like in both of those things. It's like some of it's already happened, some of it's still to come. But the Bible definitely teaches that God knows the future. We see in Isaiah 41, verses 21 through 23, it says, "Present your argument, says the Lord. Produce your evidence." I like that line. "Produce your evidence, says Jacob's king. Let them produce evidence. Let them tell us what will happen. Tell us about your earlier predictive oracles, so we may examine them and see how they were fulfilled. Or decree for us some future events. Predict how future events will turn out, so we might know you are gods. Yes, do something good or bad, so we might be frightened and in awe." So actually the context of that verse is God is actually taunting like the false idols. He's saying, hey, if these idols are gods, then have them predict the future. We see in Isaiah 46, it says, God says, "I am God and there is none like me, who announces the end from the beginning and reveals beforehand what has not yet occurred." So God is the only omniscient being, meaning he knows everything, including the future. There's actually a movement within Christianity called open theism. Has anybody ever heard of such a thing? It's pretty heretical. It basically says like God's not really sure of the future. And there's Christians that believe this, and it's not really based on biblical passages per se. I mean, I'm sure they have biblical passages to back up that idea, but it's more just because bad things happen. People don't like that. So they try to kind of come against that argument from evil by saying, well, maybe God doesn't know the future. But I think a good illustration that I've heard, I don't know any reason why this would be a bad illustration, but I've heard it said, like, time is like a parade, and we're standing on the corner of the street watching the parade go by, so we just like see it piece by piece, like in slices. But God is kind of like up in a hot air balloon. He can see the beginning, he can see the end, he knows what's going to happen, like where the various turns are, etc. So tonight I want to touch on a number of interesting prophecies, some that have already happened, and some that are still to come. So the first one, and these are kind of just prophecies that I think are really interesting, but the first one is the destruction of Tyre. Tyre is actually a city on the coast of Lebanon. Now, our book, some of you asked, like, what chapter should I read? Our book kind of touches on prophecy here and there, but there's not one chapter that's all about prophecy. And even the parts where they talk about it are like a lot later in the book, so I didn't want to be jumping around too much. But our book's not the best resource for this. I do have The Case for Christ. There is a whole chapter, I believe it's chapter 10, where I think they go into prophecy. I haven't read this in a while, but I think the whole chapter is about prophecy. And in this book, they mention another book called Science Speaks by Peter Stoner and Robert Newman. And this is a pretty good book where I got a lot of this information. So if this is something you'd like to look into further, I can give you some resources. I will say, though, this book, not even 130 pages, and for some reason, when I first started studying apologetics, I could not find this book for less than like $80. And then one day I was on Amazon, and I just saw one for like 15, bought it up as soon as I could. And then, just out of curiosity, I went back, I think it was yesterday, to see what they were going for, and the price was anywhere from $60 to $1,020.
Oh my goodness.
So
I don't know why this book is so expensive, but I'm glad I got my copy.
when was it published?
It's published in the
It's lined with gold.
1970s.
Is there a digital copy too, like Kindle?
I don't know. I didn't see one.
What was it called?
Science Speaks. So this is a pretty cool book, and I'll talk about this more as we go. So the destruction of Tyre, we find this in Ezekiel 26. Ezekiel is interesting because there's not a whole lot of disagreement on when this book was written, which is actually pretty shocking because usually skeptics or liberal Christians will come after the date of every single book. They'll come after the author. That's actually what they try to do with the book of Daniel. They try to like late date it because those prophecies are so specific. But they don't do that with Ezekiel. It was written probably in the 580s BC. And in chapter 26, verses 3 through 5, we see, "Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves. They shall destroy your walls. They shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers. And I will scrape her soil from her and make her a bare rock. She shall be in the midst of the sea, a place for the spreading of nets. For I have spoken, declares the Lord, and she shall become plunder for the nations." If we skip over to verse 7, it says, "For thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, and with horsemen, and a host of many soldiers." Now, this was actually fulfilled in Ezekiel's day. Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city from 586 BC to 573. He had some difficulty taking it. Now, you could say, okay, well, that's not that impressive. And I agree, like, I wouldn't pose that to a skeptic and say, see, prophecy. But you couldn't just get on Wikipedia back then. You couldn't just turn on the news. So Ezekiel did predict this, but it did come true in his lifetime. But the interesting thing about this prophecy is everything else came to pass long after. So Nebuchadnezzar took the city on the mainland, but by the end of the siege, the Phoenicians who lived in Tyre, they actually took everything of value and moved it to an island that was half a mile off the coast. And Nebuchadnezzar could not take the island because it was heavily fortified. So the Phoenicians lived on this island for about 200 years. Actually, it was over 200 years, until Alexander the Great came along. And so going back to verse 3 of Ezekiel 26, it says, "Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will bring many nations against you." So Alexander did not want to go into Egypt without taking care of Tyre. He had trouble taking the island as well. So he went around to various nations and said, "Let me use your navy or I'm going to destroy you." So they let him borrow their navies, and he went against Tyre, still had trouble taking the island. So what he did was, being Alexander the Great, if you know anything about him, pretty interesting guy, he had all of his men take the rubble from the old city and start throwing it into the sea. And that was not enough, so they scraped all the dirt that they could possibly find, threw that into the sea at the shallowest point, and they made a little bridge, also known as a causeway. And so we see the prophecy says that your stones and your timber and your soil will be cast into the midst of the waters. Also, Alexander was basically fulfilling this part of the prophecy. And remember, this is hundreds of years after Ezekiel. "I will make you a bare rock." They needed every single thing that they could possibly find to throw into the sea. "You shall be a place for spreading nets." I never really thought that that was that interesting of a prophecy because it is on the coast. But, God works in mysterious ways, I guess. "You shall never be rebuilt, for I am the Lord, I have spoken, declares the Lord God." Now, you can actually go on Google Maps, and after Alexander took the city, there was no incentive to remove the causeway. So over the centuries, the sediment has actually built up around that causeway, and you can find this place, and you can see now that island is part of the mainland. Now, you might be looking at that and say, "Hey, that looks like a pretty thriving metropolis. I thought that the prophecy said that it would never be rebuilt." Now, Tyre was called the Queen of the Seas. It has never been rebuilt to its former glory. But you could also say, really, the old city of Tyre is underwater. So Tyre technically has never been rebuilt. I think there also might be, see in the bottom, here I'll blow it up here, where it says that Tyre Hippodrome, those are like tourist attractions. And so they will not build anything in that area. That's kind of my own little interpretation. I haven't really heard people talk about that too much, but it is interesting that Tyre has never been rebuilt to its former glory. All of that old stuff from the city was scraped, thrown into the sea, and now the island is part of the mainland. Pretty interesting. Another pretty cool prophecy that is pretty important, having to do with people and places, is the regathering of Israel. So if you remember your history from the Bible, Israel takes the land under Joshua, but then later on they go into captivity to Babylon, to Assyria, so they're out of the land. Then they come back to the land in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, all the way till Jesus. Jesus predicts that the temple will be destroyed, not one stone will be left on another, and in fact in AD 70, the temple was destroyed. And there are people who do not believe in Jesus, who will not date the Gospel of Matthew prior to AD 70, because they say, look, he predicted that it would happen, and it did happen, so this had to be written after the fact. Same thing that they do with Daniel. Now, I don't think the evidence for Matthew is quite as conclusive as Daniel, but if you remember from a previous teaching, I think you should always ask, what's the evidence? If you just don't want to accept prophecy, that's not good enough. Just like you could say the other side of the coin is, if we want to accept prophecy, we can't just base our dates purely on prophecy. But there are many passages that talk about a regathering of Israel, and it can be a little tricky because sometimes it seems like they might be talking about the regathering after the captivity, but there are some passages where it talks about a regathering, and there are things that have never taken place. So, for example, Ezekiel 37, and I have a string of verses there, so we're going to be kind of jumping through here, but it says, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. I will bring you into the land of Israel. I will put my spirit within you, and you will come to life, and I will place you on your own land. Then you will know that I am the Lord, I have spoken and done it. That I, the Lord, have spoken and done it, declares the Lord. Behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land." Now that part, that seems like that could be talking about the first regathering. But then if you read on, "They will live on that land, and I will give to Jacob my servant, They will live on the land that I gave to Jacob my servant, in which your fathers lived, and they will live on it, they and their sons sons forever. And David my servant will be their prince forever. Now when the Jews were regathered the first time, they did not live in the land forever, and David their servant was not their prince forever. And I think that that's actually talking about the Messiah. Another interesting passage,
Why do you think that's talking about the Messiah?
like
Like David?
Jesus is like the son of David, and he's going to be the king forever of the Jews, kind of thing. Another passage, Isaiah 11:11. This was written before the Babylonian captivity. But notice, it says, "In that day the Lord will extend his hand a second time and recover the remnant that remains of his people. From Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, from the coastlands of the sea." Now when the Jews came back from captivity the first time, they were just coming back from Babylon and Assyria. They weren't coming back from all these places. And a lot of people think that this is actually talking about the end times. So a lot of these passages talk about Israel being in the land in the end times. And wouldn't you know it, in 1948, Israel became a nation again. Now to us, that doesn't seem too crazy because we've grown up, most of us, with Israel in the land. But there has never been a people group who has been pushed out of their land into the nations, and they've been able to keep their cultural identity. Usually the general rule of thumb is if a people is placed in a foreign country, surrounded by foreigners, they will be absorbed into that population within 2 to 3 generations. The Jews were out of the land for over 1,800 years. They kept their cultural identity, and they got their land back. It's pretty amazing. Now you might say, okay, but aren't you kind of reading history back into the Bible? And to that I say, I have not gone out of my way to find people who predicted this before it happened, but just in my general studies over the past 15 years, I've come across 3 without even looking. So for example, the first reference Bible was printed in 1909. I've not seen this one with my own eyes, but supposedly in that Bible, there are notes at the bottom where Cyrus Schofield said, "I don't know exactly how this is going to happen, but just by taking a plain reading of prophecy, it seems like Israel is going to get back into its land at some point." There is another book that someone let me borrow once called Dispensational Truth, and in that book, Clarence Larkin talks about how Israel will be regathered. That book was written in the 1920s. Well, 1920. There's some weird things in that book, like about the pyramids and stuff. But he does predict that Israel will be a nation again. And then, I was once reading a biography of Arthur Guinness, the inventor of Guinness beer. And strangely enough, his grandson, Henry Grattan Guinness, 60 years before Israel became a nation, predicted that they would have their land and that they would become a nation again. And if you are ever reading apologetics books and you come across a guy named Os Guinness, I think that is Henry Grattan Guinness's great-grandson. So there's kind of this cool little family line that we have here. So, it's interesting stuff. I would like to look into this a little bit further because a lot of those passages are talking about the end times, but there are other passages, one that we'll get into in a bit, where there are things that took place in the past that we know of, and in the same exact passage, it switches to something that we know is going to happen in the future. And just by reading the passage, you would never know that unless you lived through it. So
you're basically saying these people interpreted the scripture to say Israel will be back.
before it was a nation again, yes. There are many prophecies, as I said, concerning the Messiah. This is where this little book by Peter Stoner and Robert Newman comes into play. So these guys back in the 70s, they both had a background in mathematics. Newman had a background in astrophysics, and there is some stuff about space in here. But they also were believers, and as you can see, Newman had a master's of theology. So they got together, and they were looking into these prophecies of the Messiah. And they said, okay, let's just take 8 middle-of-the-road prophecies. And so when I say middle of the road, you know, there's a very general prophecy in Deuteronomy 18 where Moses says, there's going to arise a prophet like me from your kinsmen. So basically a guy is going to come along who's Jewish. people tend to think that that's talking about Jesus. But that's pretty general. Like, he's going to be a Jew. There's a very specific prophecy in Isaiah 7:14 that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. And yes, that word can mean young woman, but when the Jews translated that passage, they translated it as virgin, and obviously Mary, when the angel came to her, she was like, hey, how am I going to have a baby? I'm a virgin. That's a pretty specific prophecy, because virgins don't conceive, if you didn't know. But, so they were like, we don't want those kind of prophecies, we just want kind of things in the middle. They came up with 8. The Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. We know that from Micah 5:2. A messenger was going to prepare his way, Malachi 3:1. He rides into Jerusalem on a colt, is wounded in his hands, betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. The silver is cast down in the house of the Lord and given to a potter. He did not give a defense when oppressed. He was pierced in his hands and feet, i.e. crucifixion. And so, Stoner and Newman, instead of just doing all these probabilities themselves, they held classes with college students. And they had 13 classes with a total of 600 students. And they gave them these prophecies, and they said, you guys try to come up with a really conservative estimate for what you think the probability of each of these would be. And they wanted to be conservative because they wanted to actually be harder for our case. And so these students came up with all these probabilities, and then these two guys took those probabilities. Some of them they made even more conservative, but they said, here are the probabilities that our students came up with that we agree with. Here's why. For someone to be born in Bethlehem, it would be 1 in 28,000. There's been a lot of people that have been born in Bethlehem, but the majority of people that have ever lived have not been born there. A messenger prepares the way, it'd be like 1 in 1,000. Rides into Jerusalem on a colt, 1 in 100. Each one of these is decently improbable, but when you start multiplying them together, it becomes astronomically improbable. So these guys said, when you take all these prophecies, just these 8, put them together, divide them by the number of people who have ever lived, you get 1 chance in 10 to the 17th. That's 1 with 17 zeros behind it. They say, how could you wrap your mind around this number? So they give an illustration. If you were to take the state of Texas, bury it 2 feet deep in silver dollars, you take one of those silver dollars, mark it with an X, and throw it out there, and then somehow they're all like mixed in together. And then I send you out there blindfolded, and I say you can walk around as long as you want, but at some point you need to reach down there, dig as deep as you want, but pick out a silver dollar. You would have 1 chance in 10 to the 17 of picking the silver dollar that was marked. They go on in this book to talk about what it would be like for 48 prophecies, and instead of using silver dollars, they use like electrons, and I don't even remember what the what the illustration was, but it was pretty ridiculous, so I'm not even going to go over that. But very improbable, even just to get 8 decently general prophecies. Now let's think like a skeptic here. What are some ways that a skeptic could come against that? Any weaknesses you see?
Well, I mean, somebody who doesn't believe the Bible is true would say, well, you got all those prophecies from the Bible. Like,
Yeah, that's true.
so there in itself, they would just discount it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a couple things with that. The Bible's not one book, it's a library of books. So it is the same source in one way, but it's different sources in another. I would also say, yeah, I mean, that's part of it. I think a lot of people approach the Bible and they are already skeptical. But it is interesting, like in my readings, the more someone knows about how we do history, the more they will actually accept in the Bible. Even if they're not a Christian, usually people don't accept, if they're not a believer, they won't accept the supernatural. But I bet you could take those prophecies, and if you didn't tell someone that those were prophesied, they would have no problem with them until they found out that it was like a fulfillment of prophecy. So I do think that this is limited, but I think as Christians who take the Bible seriously, like I mentioned before, apologetics isn't just for the unbeliever. But I think that's pretty cool. I know I was listening to a talk once by a guy who converted from Zen Buddhism to Christianity. And he said there's a prophecy in Buddhism that says when the iron bird flies, Buddhism will spread to the West. That's interesting. I think he said that that's the only prophecy they have. I don't know if that's true. But I remember being bothered by that. Now, on the one hand, we know that the satanic realm can prophesy, but it's nothing the way God can prophesy. And I think that if somebody is, a little more open, this would be a good thing to kind of present to them for the veracity of the Bible, the veracity of Christ.
Were any of those prophecies, of the ones that you just showed, having to do with, none of them were rising? People could look at that and be like, well, great, he was still just a prophet, not the Messiah. Would that be?
Yeah, but if there's no supernatural intervention, then that seems strange, because you would think it's a miracle to pick the one silver dollar in the entire state of Texas, but you wouldn't think it was a miracle for even a prophet. I mean, technically Jesus was a prophet, but if the whole aspect of God is not there, it still doesn't make any sense. That's how I would answer that. So.
Yeah, back to the silver bird. Is that an airplane or something else?
Yeah, he's talking about an airplane.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there's actually a documentary on that, which I just discovered today, but I'll put that on my watch list. But yeah, I think that's the idea. When the airplane is invented, Buddhism will spread. Which is true. That happened. Those prophecies, very general. My last prophecy, very specific. This is Daniel 9. I think this will be fun. In a previous teaching, I've told you how there were certain things that I had to hear taught 3 times before I even began to understand them. This is one of those things that I was talking about. But don't feel bad, because if you've gone to our church for more than a year, Daniel's already talked about this twice. So maybe tonight's the night. It's a very interesting, very specific prophecy. It starts in Daniel 9, verse 1. It says, "In the first year of Darius, son of that guy, who was of Median descent, and who had been appointed king over the Babylonian Empire, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, came to understand from the sacred books that according to the word of the Lord disclosed to the prophet Jeremiah, the years of the fulfilling of the desolation of Jerusalem were 70 in number." So Daniel is in exile in Babylon. He's reading the Bible. He comes across a prophecy. He takes it in a straightforward manner, and he comes to know that even though he's been in captivity since he was a little kid, and now he's an old man, he comes to know that the captivity is almost over. And we're not exactly sure how many years were left. It could have been anywhere from 1 to maybe 3 to 5. But he was probably reading Jeremiah 25 or 29. So in Jeremiah 25, verse 8, it says, "Therefore the Lord who rules over all says, you have not listened to what I said. So I, the Lord, affirm that I will send for all the peoples of the north and my servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and all the nations that surround it." Then in verse 11, "This whole area will become a desolate wasteland. These nations will be subject to the king of Babylon for 70 years. Jeremiah 29:10 says, "For the Lord says, only when the 70 years of Babylonian rule are over will I again take up consideration of you. Then I will fulfill my gracious promise to you and restore you to your homeland." So there would be the first restoration. And Daniel finds out the captivity lasts 70 years. Daniel starts to pray. And this prayer is decently long. It's the majority of the chapter. We're not going to read the prayer, but notice in Jeremiah it says, "You have not listened to what I said." And in the prayer, Daniel says, all Israel has broken your law and turned away by not obeying you. Now his praying is interrupted if we pick up in verse 20, back in Daniel 9 here. It says, while I was still speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people, Israel, and presenting my request before the Lord, my God, concerning his holy mountain, yes, while I was still praying, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen previously in a vision, was approaching me in my state of extreme weariness, around the time of the evening offering. He spoke to me, instructing me as follows, Daniel, I have now come to impart understanding to you. At the beginning of your requests, a message went out, and I have come to convey it to you, for you are of great value in God's sight. Therefore, consider the message and understand the vision. This can be really confusing, but I want to point out, it says in the text, this is meant to be understood. Consider the message and understand the vision. The prophecy is only 4 verses long. We're going to go through the whole thing, and then I'll break it down verse by verse. 70 weeks have been determined concerning your people and your holy city to put an end to rebellion, to bring sin to completion, to atone for iniquity, to bring in perpetual righteousness, to seal up the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. So know and understand, from the issuing of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed one, a prince, arrives, there will be a period of 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will again be built with plaza and moat, but in distressful times. Now after the 62 weeks, an anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. As for the city and the sanctuary, the people of the coming prince will destroy them. But the end will come speedily like a flood. Until the end of the war that has been decreed, there will be destruction. And verse 27, that's where we know this is talking about future events. This is actually what Daniel's been talking about for the past weeks. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of that week, he will bring sacrifices and offerings to a halt. On the wing of abominations, he will come, one who destroys, until the decreed end is poured out on the one who destroys. Now, we're not going to go over that last verse, but again, notice, everything up till then has already happened. It switches to things that are still to come. So back to verse 24. 70 weeks have been determined concerning your people and your holy city to put an end to rebellion. That hasn't happened. To bring sin to completion. That hasn't happened. To atone for iniquity. Now that's starting to sound like Jesus. To bring in perpetual righteousness. Hasn't totally happened. To seal up the prophetic vision. Now if that means the Bible will be complete, that could be in the time of Jesus, talking about the time of Jesus. And to anoint the most holy place. Now, that first verse says 70 weeks have been determined. This is where it gets a little confusing. Because when we talk about a week, like if I say, I'll see you in 3 weeks, you know that I'm talking about 3 units of 7. So 21 days. Every time I say week, you know I'm talking about days. In Hebrew, the word for week is a little bit more elastic than that. You could have a week of days, like in Exodus 20. You could have a week of weeks. So if there's 7 days in a week of days, then there's 7 weeks in a week of weeks. You see this in Leviticus 23, 15, and 16. I've also heard that there could be a week of months, but when I looked up those passages, they were a little bit more vague, so I didn't include those. But a week of months would be 7 months. You could also have a week of years. And so think of like when Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years. That was a week of years. He was working for a week of years. This passage is talking about a week of years. 7 groups of 7 years. Now that can seem a little far out. This passage can seem very confusing. But if you look, there are some really good signal words here. So know and understand, from the issuing of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, a prince, arrives, there will be a period of 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So you can kind of put this on a timeline. From the issue to rebuild until the anointed one comes, 7 weeks and 62 weeks. After the 62 weeks, the anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. We know from other passages, a lot of times when it says be cut off, such as in Isaiah 53, it says, indeed he was cut off from the land of the living. He will die. Now, Daniel says that this passage ends with the triumphal entry, and he says you can get it down to the day. I'm just going to go for a year here. So the triumphal entry and the death, you get the same effect here. It's easier to hit a range. It's more difficult to hit a year. It's even more difficult to hit the day. So I'm not going to make it too hard on myself here. From the issuing of the command to rebuild Jerusalem, how do we know when that command took place? We can read that in Nehemiah 2. And it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it to the king. So Nehemiah was the king's wine taster, which might sound like a pretty decent job, but the whole point of him being there was to make sure that it wasn't poisoned. Now I had not been sad in the king's presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid. It could be that the king's saying, "Hey, wine taster, you don't look so good. Is that because of your mood, or is that because you've been drinking some of my wine that could be poisoned?" It's kind of interesting. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress, which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go." And the king granted them to me because the good hand of God was on me. So Nehemiah 2 says that this was in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. It also says that this was the month of Nisan in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. We know about Artaxerxes outside the Bible from Plutarch. You can also just look it up on Wikipedia, if that's your thing. Artaxerxes began his reign in December of 465. If you don't like looking on Wikipedia, it's also in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now here's where it gets a little hairy. This part is a little bit difficult because it's Artaxerxes' 20th year, but Nehemiah says that this took place in the month of Nisan. So Nehemiah is working from a Jewish calendar. We are working from our own calendar. The month of Nisan is in the springtime. So it's thought you actually have to add a year. If you take 465 BC, we'll represent that as a negative number because it counts down. You add 20, you get 445. Because Nisan is in the spring, you actually need to start at 444. Okay? It's a little confusing, I think. But we have our start date, 444. That is the from in our timeline. Everybody tracking with me? Okay? Until the anointed one, a prince arrives. That is our ending date. How do we know the year Jesus died? We'll start with a range. We know from Josephus that Pilate was ruling over that region from 26 to 36. Most people say it had to be between 30 or 33. The top two dates are in 30 and 33, but some people also go with 32 for various reasons. I take a date of AD 33 for a couple reasons. Number one, there was a guy named Sejanus who rebelled against Caesar, and that was in 31 AD. Now, Sejanus had appointed a lot of people to their positions, and so if you had been appointed by Sejanus, you wanted to keep a low profile because the question was, were you loyal to Sejanus or were you loyal to Caesar? Now, Pilate was a bloodthirsty, monstrous murderer, but when the Jews come to him, they say, "Kill this man." Pilate says, I find no fault with him. I'm not going to crucify him. And the Jews come back and they say, if you don't kill this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Now that's interesting that they would say that. It's also interesting, why does Pilate let the Jews push him around? Well, if it's after 31, with this whole Sejanus issue, that makes sense. Pilate did not want to draw attention to himself, and the Jews are kind of using that as leverage against him. So you still have a 32 date, you still have a 33 date, but I think if you take a 32 date, you can't have the crucifixion on a Friday. And usually people go with a Friday crucifixion, Good Friday, we still celebrate that. I mentioned last week that there's something that I disagreed with Daniel on. I think I gave you the wrong impression based on some of the questions you were asking me. Daniel actually takes a 32 date. Heretic, I know. He takes it for different reasons. You can do the same math, but he actually takes the start date at 465. I take the start date at 444. Wait. He takes the start date at 445. I take the start date at 444. He gets to AD 32. I get to AD 33. He has actually changed his view. He started out doing 33, then he said 32. And when I heard that, I thought he's not counting for the year 0. So we talked about it, and actually he is counting for the year 0. But unfortunately, he comes to a different date than me. But it is on Wikipedia. 30 or 33. I mean, it has to be true, right? If it's on Wikipedia. So we're going to take my date of AD 33. So what is the time duration? From the issuing of the command until the anointed one, 7 weeks and 62 weeks of years. 7 times 7 is 49. Some people say, why the break? Why not just say 69 weeks? Some have said maybe that's how long it took to rebuild the temple. Who knows? But 62 times 7 is 434. 49 plus 434 equals 483. You actually have to add 1 because there's no year 0. A timeline and a number line are different. You go straight from 1 BC to 180. So if you take negative 444 for BC, you add 483 plus 1, you get 40 AD. Now, why didn't that work? I actually broke one of the basic rules of Bible interpretation. You don't take your own culture and force it on the text. Good examples of this would be slavery and adoption. In the Roman mind, they did not think of slavery the way we think of slavery. They did not think of adoption the same way we think of adoption. Usually, you can get away with a lot. I mean, you don't need to have a degree in Bible backgrounds to interpret the Bible, but this is one passage where you have to know the cultural differences. The Jews had a lunar year, which is based on 360 days, not a solar year, which is 365. So the way you convert this is, you take the number of years, which is 483, you times it by the number of days in each year, which is 360, you get 173,880. You divide that by 365, you will get 476 years. So 444 BC plus 476 plus 1, because there's no year 0, and you get AD 33. How about that? Isn't that cool? Is that cool, Dad? If you don't think that's cool, you don't understand the argument. Some ways that people could object to this. Maybe they just made it up. The problem with that is they did not have as accurate a timeline as we do. You could not get on Wikipedia and look it up. You did not have the Encyclopedia Britannica. In fact, you know how the Bible says like there were false messiahs in Jesus' day, and they would like rise up for a little bit and then they'd be put down? That's because they knew like the general time when the Messiah was supposed to come from some of these prophecies, but they couldn't nail it down. And so you've got a lot of this activity because sometimes these guys would be like, hey, it's almost time for the Messiah. Maybe I'm him. And get crucified, basically. The other interesting thing, the Bible never uses this as an apologetic. The early church quoted Daniel 9 over and over and over again, but they didn't quote the 7 weeks and 62 weeks. They never used that as proof. And I heard one guy say, this whole prophecy was not for the early church, it's for us. Because we actually have the means to figure it out. It's kind of an interesting way to think about it. Some people might say maybe later Christians changed the Old Testament. This is not a very popular view because it's so out there. But it would be impossible to change all the copies of the Old Testament. Not only that, but when the Jews had a translation of the Bible called the Septuagint, you would have to change those too. The Septuagint has this prophecy in it, and it predates Christ by 150 to 200 years. I might have that wrong. It predates Christ by 100 to 250 years. I think that's how that went. There are also copies of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, those have been hidden. Those had been hidden during the time of Christ, and we just found those in the 1940s. So you couldn't have changed it. Not a popular view. Another one that I came up with, you just said your pastor comes up with a different date. One thing I would like to point out, Daniel can be wrong. He didn't say AD 332, he said AD 32. We're only off by a year from each other. When I listened to his teaching again, because I was actually in there when he gave that teaching, I listened to it again online. I thought he was wrong, but then I found another person that is very trustworthy, and he came up with a 32 AD date, and I almost just like chucked this whole teaching. I didn't want to have anything to do with it, because I didn't want to have to stand up here and be like, we get different dates. I actually do think 33 is correct. But then it dawned on me, the prophecy is very exact. It's the history that's kind of blurry. And there's a really good book by Harold Hoehner called The Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ. I think he lands on a 33 AD date. But he says, it's interesting, history pivots on the death of Christ. And the history is actually pretty sketchy. Like, it's hard to nail down the date exactly. This isn't some prophecy about some metal bird taking Christianity across the nations or anything like that. This is very specific, very precise. And if you can get down so close to, it comes up to, it's either 32 AD or it's 33 AD, the problem is not with the prophecy, the problem is with us. So there's something that we don't know. One of us is wrong. I think I know who it is. I just want to put it all out there so you're not like blindsided someday. There are certain disagreements, but still, pretty cool prophecy. Got anything to say? Anybody?
So was the Jewish calendar always the same number of days? It wasn't like the Roman calendar where they inserted the calends?
Like as far as leap year, is that what you're...
No, they didn't have leap year, but they would make their calculations and insert a certain number of days into a month in order to bring them back in tune with the seasons.
The way I understand this is the Jews had a leap month where they would, after a while, they would add an entire month into the year. That's always been a question for me on this prophecy, but I think, did you notice I didn't add leap year in my calculations? I think if you don't add the leap year for us, you don't need to add the leap month for them. But I think that addresses your question because they would bring it back into sync by adding that leap month. Muslims don't do that. They have a lunar calendar, and that's why their holidays migrate throughout the year because they don't correct. And if you know anything about Islam, during Ramadan you're not supposed to eat or drink anything during the daylight hours. Can you imagine living in Saudi Arabia? Can you imagine living in Kuwait? I saw some guys give a presentation on Kuwait in college, and they said, we don't even go swimming in the summertime because it's too hot. Sounds terrible. But yeah, I think that's how that works. So.